You're live.
All right, we ready to go?
You're live.
Okay, great. So good evening and welcome to our Park Authority Board meeting. I'm Bill Bowie and I call the May 27th, 2020 Park Authority Board meeting to order. To conduct this meeting wholly electronically and to effectuate both the emergency procedures authorized by FOIA and the emergency ordinance, the Park Authority Board needs to make certain findings and determinations for the record, as we did in our first electronic meeting. During our meeting, if you wish to be recognized, raise your hand, and when I recognize you, please state your name. This will ensure that you are recognized and the public knows who is speaking. If you intend to vote nay or abstain on any item, we will need to do a roll call on those votes. Because of each member of this board is participating in this meeting from a separate location, we must verify that a quorum of members is participating and that each member's voice is clear, audible, and at an appropriate volume for all of the other members to hear. Accordingly, I'm going to conduct a roll call and ask each board member participating in this meeting to state your name and the location from where you are participating. I ask that each of you pay close attention to ensure that you hear each one of your colleagues. Following this roll call, we will vote to establish that every member can hear every other member's voice. And we will start going alphabetically. Dr. Adu.
Abna Adu in my residence in Lee District.
Dr. Carter.
Cynthia Jacobs Carter at my residence in Lee District.
Maggie Godbold.
Maggie Godbold at my residence in the Sully District.
Linwood Gorham.
This is Linwood Gorham from my residence in the Mount Vernon District.
Tim Hackman.
Tim Hackman from my residence in the Drainsville District.
Ron Kendall.
Ron Kendall in my home in Mason District.
Faisal Khan.
Faisal Khan at my residence at Providence District.
Ken Quincy.
Ken Quincy at my residence in the Providence District.
Kyle Stone.
Kyle Stone from my residence in the Braddock District.
Mike Thompson.
Thompson from my residence in the Springfield District.
And Jim Zook.
Jim Zook from my residence in the Springfield District.
And I'm Bill Bowie, and I'm at my residence in the Hunter Mill District. At this point, I will pass the virtual gavel to Vice Chairman Quincy so that I may be heard to make the requisite motion. I move that each member's voice may be adequately heard by each other member of this board.
Ken Quincy, you have heard the motion. Is there a second?
Mike Thompson, I second the motion.
The motion, excuse me, Ken Quincy, it has been moved and seconded. Is there discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed say nay. That motion passes.
All right, this is Bill Bowie again. Second, this is for the need of an electronic meeting. Having established that each member's voice may be heard by every other member, we must establish the nature of the emergency that compels these emergency procedures, the fact that we are meeting electronically, what type of electronic communication is being used, and how we have arranged for public access to this meeting. Therefore, I move that the state of emergency caused by COVID-19 pandemic makes it unsafe for this board to physically assemble and unsafe for the public to physically attend any such meeting. And that as such, FOIA's usual procedures, which require the physical assembly of this board and the physical presence of the public, cannot be implemented safely or practically. I further move that this board may conduct this meeting electronically through a dedicated video conference line. It is so moved.
Ken Quincy, you have heard the motion. Is there a second?
Tim Hackman, I second the motion.
The motion has been moved and seconded. Is there discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Mr. Chairman, the motion is approved.
Thank you, sir. So finally, we're going to need to dispense with FOIA's usual procedures to assure continuation of operations. It is next required that all matters addressed on today's agenda must address the state of emergency itself, or are statutorily required or necessary to continue operations and the discharge of this board's lawful purposes, duties, and responsibilities. It is so moved.
Ken Quincy, you have heard the motion. Is there a second?
Mike Thompson, I second the motion.
The motion has been moved and seconded. Is there discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Mr. Chairman, the motion carries.
Thank you, sir. Now that the preliminary matters are complete, we can begin the meeting. Thanks, everybody, for your cooperation. Countywide admin item number 1 is the adoption of the minutes of the April 29th, 2020 Park Authority Board meeting.
Mike Thompson, I second the motion.
Bill Bowie, again, is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed say nay. The motion carries. Mike Barrett.
Okay, Hannah, if you don't mind, can you please bring up the budget PowerPoint? And while Hannah's bringing that up, this is really just a PowerPoint presentation, kind of following up on what we had provided to the board a month ago when Cindy Walsh and I kind of updated the board on the status. Okay, and Hannah, there should be another one. It should actually be a PowerPoint presentation.
Mike, what's the title on that one?
It should be like FY20 budget update, financial initiatives in response to COVID-19. I thought Sarah was going to probably send it, I believe, to Don yesterday.
Don, did you get that one?
Give me just 1 second.
And this is kind of give you a little bit of budget background and then kind of really lead into the first 2 action items. So hopefully we can bring it up. If not, I can kind of hit on a few highlights of the PowerPoint and then we can move right into action item 1. Any luck with that, Don, or should we just move forward without it?
If someone can email it to me quickly.
Hannah, we're looking for it right now. Mailed it to Don.
Perfect. I have it. I'm gonna pull it up now.
All right, thank you.
Sorry for the delay.
All right, thank you, Hannah. Mike Baird here, and okay. Probably just go to next slide when it fully loads.
Are you seeing it yet?
I saw it briefly. Now I don't see it, to be honest with you.
You have something blocking the PowerPoint, Hannah.
There we go.
There it is.
There we go. Thank you very much. So kind of just giving you a quick update of why we're bringing some of these action items to you tonight is really just the budget impacts of the COVID-19 to the Park Authority. A couple of these things you saw last month, but really as we started moving into March, we started getting some customer cancellations as people started getting nervous attending classes and so forth. As we moved into mid-March and on March 16th started closing our facilities. At that point, we really started seeing some significant cancellations, refunds for classes. As we mentioned last time too, and the great thing for the county is that some payroll actions are still continuing. Staff are still getting paid, and these are some FMLA actions and so forth. But it does come at a cost. And then, as we mentioned then, and even now, additional expenses, all the PPE cost, park monitors, enhanced cleanings, and so forth to make our facilities safe, all are adding to our budget situation. Next slide, please. So the impacts here, as we had mentioned there, the financial impacts for the revenue fund, we are looking at a negative net position ranging somewhere in the magnitude of 8.3 million to negative $13.5 million. And when we presented that last month, there were certain ranges. And, unfortunately, it looks like we're going to be probably moving closer to the 13.5 with our facilities still closed. So that kind of really leads us into the two board action items that we're bringing to you tonight. So Hannah, if you could go to the next slide, please. So this is the first one. This is action item 1. And this is asking the board's approval to use the revenue and operating fund stabilization reserve. In that reserve, we have a fund balance of $2.6 million. Under the information and rules there, you can see really the purpose of this was set aside for this reason, for cash flow and emergency situations. The board wisely took action a year ago to allow up to the use up to 100% of the current available balance. And then we replenish that from the revenue and operating fund net above $200,000. And then you can see there the recommendation tonight, action item 1, is to take action to authorize using up to 100% of that balance. Next slide, please. The next two slides are related to action item 2. In this one, we're looking to use FY 2020 telecom revenue. We're estimating that revenue about $687,000. For the note, this is all revenue that's being earned this year, FY 20. None of this revenue has been appropriated to any projects yet, so will not really impact anything already underway. And we are holding back monies for like the Lee Spray Park, staff WPFO, and to support the concert series. And then underneath that, you see the recommendation. Again, this is part of action item 2 to allow this one-time transfer of this revenue into the park revenue and operating fund, Fund 80,000. Hannah, next slide, please. Okay, and this is the park revenue capital sinking fund. In that fund, we have a balance of about $750,000. We have the rules kind of laid out there. This is really designed for long-term life cycle maintenance. The board took action back in June to allow us to use that for capital equipment. What we're asking tonight is a recommendation for an action item. Expand that use to include operating expenses, and those operating expenses really to help cover the COVID-19. So that kind of gives you a brief kind of overview of where we are now. If there's no questions on that, I guess we are ready to move to action item 1.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mike. This is Bill Bowie again. Is there Is there any discussion on the items up for approval? Okay. So countywide, action item number 1 is the request to use the Revenue and Operating Fund Stabilization Reserve.
Ken Quincy, I move the approval to use up to 100% of the Revenue and Operating Fund Stabilization Reserve for the established Park Authority guidelines that were adopted June 25th, 2014 and updated on September 18th, 2019.
Mike Thompson, I second the motion.
Is there any discussion on the matter? Seeing that there's no discussion, all those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. The motion carries. Countywide action item number 2 is the approval and transfer of the FY 2020 telecommunications revenue, the Park Improvement Fund from Fund 800-380-300 to the Park Revenue and Operating Fund, Fund 800-380,000, and expand the use of the park revenue capital sinking fund in Fund 800-3080,300 to include operating expenses to cover unplanned emergency situations.
Ken Quincy, motion to approve of FY 2020 revenue from telecommunications, excluding Lee Park, WPO, and concert series funding from the Park Improvement Fund 800C80300 to the Park Revenue and Operating Fund 800C80000 at the June 30, 2020, and expand use of the Park Revenue Capital Sinking Fund PR00101 to include operating expenses to help cover unplanned COVID-19 expenses.
This is Maggie Godbold. I second the motion.
Is there any discussion on the matter? I know that I did talk to some of you about it. This is for FY 2020 only. I know that a number of folks are certainly concerned about what we're going to do going forward with this, as well as introducing the whole concept around equity and looking how we equitably can share some of this when projects come up. So that certainly has been taken into consideration, and I certainly thank you for all of your support of this measure. All of those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The motion carries. Thank you. In the Drainsville District, action item number 3 is the scope approval for the Colvin Run Mill wheel and flume replacement.
This is Tim Hackman. I move the approval of the project scope to replace the wheel and flume at Colvin Run Mill.
Ken Quincy, I second the motion.
This is Bill Bowie. Is there any discussion? Seeing there's none, all those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. The motion carries. We move on to information items. Information item number 1 is countywide. It's the COVID-19 Rec Center reopening model with a presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Kirk Kincannon, Executive Director of the Fairfax County Park Authority. Nick DeRay is going to present the information. Nick, of course, you know, is our Marketing Director for the Park Authority. He and his staff, as well as staff on the Rec Center team, have looked at the data and compared information across the U.S., and we felt it prudent that you are provided this update relative to the impacts and moving forward to the Rec Center and programs that we offer. Nick, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you. This is Nick DeRay. Hannah, could you bring up the presentation, please? Can you put it in presentation mode? Thank you.
Yeah, it's going. Can you see it?
Yes. Okay, and now that we're in the festive COVID mood, yeah, thank you. So since the outbreak of COVID began, we've been monitoring information in these three areas to help develop and refine the rec center reopening strategy when that may come. And today we wanted to share a few of the main findings from that information collection that's been influencing our strategy development. Next slide. Starting with the general consumer trends and the polling data from a variety of places that's been going on. Next slide. As we recognized very early on, it's funny, you find some things out early on, they're a revelation, and then a week later it's old news and people roll your eyes when you hear it. But when we initially started this process, I think we didn't really know what we were getting into. And so it was enlightening when the Gates Foundation early on identified sort of what they consider a three-phase recovery, where in the semi-normal phase, what we're going to be getting into in the reopenings is really going to be an 18 to 24 month period that is going to last probably until there's some kind of biological control. And that furthermore, that semi-normal phase might represent a W-shaped recovery, meaning depending on what happens with the virus, we might be in and out of different phases of recovery. What that means, and there's been a lot of conversation in the health club industry, and what that means in the health club industry is people are searching vehemently for the need for revenue sources that aren't reliant on brick and mortar facilities being open. Next slide. One of the things that is important to track is just general consumer concern with the coronavirus outbreak, because to the extent that people are highly concerned, then they're not going to return to normal consumer activity. So you can see on this particular poll that that's been through a number of waves starting at the beginning of March, most recent one at the beginning of May, that concern is high, but it is gradually beginning to bend with the curve. Next slide. The polling firm called Kelton that's been doing an intermittent COVID survey of the American public, and they've got an index that measures what they call the American breaking point. So on a variety of questions, they identify basically the point at which people can't take being sequestered in their homes anymore. And early on in their polling, they identified pretty much the time period we're in right now as the point at which the majority of Americans would be getting sort of antsy, reaching their breaking point. And initially, what they thought is that might result in sort of consumer rebellion, manifesting itself in increased flaunting of guidelines and recommendations from the authorities. What they're seeing in their most common or their most current survey data, though, is not that, but that people are sort of hunkering down and becoming more concerned with self-care. So, for example, 49% are saying they're exercising at home more than they did pre-COVID. About a third are saying they're prioritizing their mental health more than they used to. Another third are saying that they're starting a new hobby. So these are the ways that people are beginning to manifest sort of reaching that break point. Next slide. And you can see here we have a couple of local data sources that using mobile location data, cell phone data, we can identify what people are doing in the community. University of Maryland in the transportation department is combining vehicular mobile data with cell data to identify the percentage of people in various communities throughout the country that are staying home. And here you can see the trend curve for Fairfax County. And starting at about mid-March and going now through the most recent data as of the time we did this presentation, which was about 18 May. And what you can see is about halfway through the curve, through the graph, we've peaked. And in weeks, if you looked at weekly averages of this data, it would be weeks 4 and 5, which are early to mid April. We peaked at about 48% of people staying home. Now we're down in the sort of 40-ish range. Next slide. And I think you've seen the variations of this graph at some point, but this is another data set. This is the Google data set that's looking at location data and identifying where people are in the community in terms of retail establishments, transportation outlets, and one of the items that they track is cell phones that are in parks at any one point in time in a particular day. And they track this data based on a comparison with the baseline, which would have been off to the left of this chart before this chart started. And there would be 7 baselines, one for each day of the week, that represented the average of the weekdays beginning of January through about mid-February. What you can see in the left-hand side of this chart before we closed parks is a lot of activity in parks above baseline. You would figure that because we were moving from sort of winter time period into more warmer time periods. Then the chart goes below 0. So percent of utilization or percent of in-park presence below baseline. And that's reflecting the point and in time at which we closed parks. And then further on in May, you can see the beginnings of a couple of pulses up again, representing when people get antsy, they're looking for outlets. The safest outlets are outdoors, and our parks become attractive for that. Next slide. Kelton classifies consumers into 3 groups based on some questioning that they're asking in their polls, and they separate the groups into what they call maintainers, adapters, and disruptors. Maintainers and adapters we can sort of consider as one general group where people that belong in those groups feel like there might be some disruption in their lives, some temporary changes, but in terms of permanent change as a result of COVID, there won't be much. Disruptors are really diametrically opposite of that. They see large numbers of disruptions on the horizon. And in terms of the way that they intend to interact with brands, in the future, they see radical changes on the horizon. So disruptors are a group that Kelton cautions that if we're in the business of selling something or trying to get people to use something that we need to pay attention to. They're a group that's growing larger. At the beginning of the Kelton polling, they were about 20% of the consumer public. Now they're a little bit under a third. Interestingly, and most importantly for us, they're heavily focused on the leisure and entertainment industry businesses and activities. Demographically, they're most likely to be 35 to 54, urban, suburban, married with kids, which is right in the wheelhouse of our primary target market for programs in particular. Next slide. So the Kelton, when consumers are talking to the Kelton interviewers, they're making it very clear that really they only want to hear certain messages from brands right now. And first and foremost, at the top of the list, brands need to communicate how they're adapting the shopping experience to make consumers feel safer. So consumer protection is definitely job one right now. This was echoed in a club industry webinar panel that a number of us on staff have been monitoring on a regular basis that meets every Wednesday. It has for, I don't know, 6 or 7 weeks. And a few weeks ago, the CEO of MXM, which is the main consumer feedback polling firm in the club industry, was talking about what they're hearing in their surveying, and he made the point that pre-COVID, if someone was going to visit one of your health club facilities or a recreation center facility, in our case, that you had to make the case that you were better, faster, cheaper, or cooler than the other offerings. Now, the main thing that people want to hear is before that is, what are you doing to keep me safe? Next slide. Some industry trends and best practices that are heavily influencing Brian Law's development of his opening plan. We're going to go through next real briefly. Next slide. First and foremost, virtual programming, which started out very early on, is becoming sort of an expected part of service delivery in health club and leisure provision in general. It quickly evolved from just throwing up as much curated content as you could get on your website. And by curated content, I mean anybody else's existing content that you had access to and that you were able to put up on your site. And we're moving from that now to brands developing their own content so that they're developing their own brand loyalty. We started out everybody doing free. We're beginning to move a little bit more to fee. You see that more in the club industry now than you do in parks, but you see some examples of that in parks. This image to the right here is the first virtual programming brochure that we've seen in parks that came out about late April, and is from a park district outside of Chicago. Fee-based models, in particular in the club industry, run the gamut from monthly subscriptions to annual memberships, from value-added premium memberships to purchasing sort of programming in a series, kind of akin to the way we're typically used to programming. But the key is that nobody is expecting consumers will pay the same price point for virtual service that they had for in-person brick and mortar experiences. So just to give you some examples, in the club industry, sort of probably the most robust online virtual programming locally here was by a DC health club chain called Vita Fitness, who actually had a virtual presence up before COVID hit. And so they're charging $49 a month for their virtual content to become a virtual member. But that's in comparison to their typical monthly brick and mortar price of $120 to $150 a month. The typical price, the most common price point industry-wide right now is $9.99. And compared to what the average brick and mortar membership is nationwide, based on IRSA data, current IRSA data at $58 a month. Next slide. Staying connected to customers is another key trend. Regular communication with membership via email and social media during closure has been critical in the club industry, so that people basically don't forget about us. And so, and because so that people are reminded, customers are reminded that they're appreciated and that they're missed. Consumers are craving connections in their isolation. We'll talk a little bit about our own survey data in the next chunk of the presentation, and we'll see an evidence of that there. And in terms of messaging, the consensus is that the messaging has to be sort of community related, support related. We're here for you, telling people what we're doing to build their trust, to express gratitude. You can see this reflected in just about any ad that you're going to see in general media now. If you want to buy a Toyota now, first we say how appreciative we are, and we're here for you. All you have to do is buy one of our trucks. Next slide. Nobody, even in the private sector, has the financials figured out on what's going on right now. The real estate firm Piper Jaffray estimates that there might be as much as a 30% contraction in the health club industry in the coming year, maybe 18 months. Several chains have already or are already in the midst of at least considering bankruptcy as one of their options for getting through the crisis. Next slide. We've looked at a number of industry best practices as people sort of are developing their opening strategies, and as other states have reopened earlier, we're seeing what people are doing, and a lot of this is influencing our strategy, and indeed not ours, but is becoming fairly commonplace. These are listed here, and we'll go through these one at a time. On the left, multi-phase reopening is a very common strategy. We first saw in Georgia with Gold's Gyms in Georgia, but essentially it's starting with what I'll call facility users, people that use equipment, people that swim laps in the pool, anything that doesn't involve an instructor that's sort of self-administered. Those things are tending to open first at, of course, the appropriate social distance requirements and et cetera. And then only after that do people with multi-phase reopening strategies envision bringing back fitness programming and then eventually moving on to full opening. Managing capacity, managing admission is a big issue because everybody's looking at reduced capacity in their facilities because of the need for appropriate social distancing. When we first started looking at how we would divide up equipment in our fitness areas, Brian Laws was working with sort of the 6 feet social distancing, 36 square feet per piece of equipment. But what we found out very quickly is that was inadequate because it didn't account for walkways around equipment and keeping distance that way. So he's working with 110 square feet now. Other places are using as much as 200 square feet. Reserved entry for all uses is becoming a necessity. So you know that anything programmatic was always reserved entry, at least things you had to sign up and pay for. But you know, general facility usage for any health club, for any rec center, was just kind of walk in and pay as you go, or walk in and check in if you were a member or a pass holder. Now, all of that use is going to be reserved. And people are also moving to, related to that, time periods for usage. So we first saw this up in Baltimore with Brick Bodies, where that chain will be coming out with 90-minute use periods, 30-minute shutdown periods for cleaning, 90 minutes, 30 minutes, 90 minutes, 30 minutes, the whole way throughout the day. Modified operating hours. are also very commonplace. Health screenings, most typically in the form of temperature checks, are very commonplace. Of course, enhanced cleaning protocols, not only to meet CDC requirements, but also to give customers the confidence that facilities are safe enough for them to come back. All of these things, in particular, laying out of how equipment works in a facility, how people will traverse through a facility. Companies have been using customer journey mapping, where they've developed a set of imaginary customers that represent their most common types of users, and they walk through the facility as that user. So a mom with kids taking a program, a senior that's just using the cardio equipment, those kinds of customer personas, walking through as each one of those through the facility, how they would use the facility to get an idea of where pinch points are, where we need more cleansing stations, etc., in order to get a better sense of what we need to do to make things functional in this environment. Staff training, you see a tremendous amount of opening strategies involving newer kinds of staff training. So the new cleaning protocols and executing those cleaning protocols, because most places are having sort of an all hands on deck attitude towards that. But also sort of customer sensitivity training, conflict resolution training is very common as well. Out of the recognition that some customers will become militant about whether other customers are doing appropriate social distancing, appropriate equipment cleaning, etc. And so the last thing that facilities want is conflicts between customers. So that's been something we see quite a bit. And then greater level of member accountability than in terms of the social distancing and in terms of equipment cleaning than has been expected of customers in the past is also very common. Next slide. Okay, so the last chunk here, we're going to look at some of the feedback that we're getting from our own pass holders, our own rec center members. Between May 8 and May 18, we sent out a request to all our adult pass holders that were still active at the time of the closure. Asked them to answer a few questions for us about what they were thinking about coming back. We've got almost 4,900 responses. About a third of our pass holders responded, which is highly unusual for us. We usually get a response rate for our regular member surveys of about half of that. Next slide. So these data are based. These are just a few of the snapshots from that survey that are based on that almost 4,900 responses from our membership. On the left-hand side of this chart, first want to look at the question that we asked people, once the authorities allow us to resume operation, how soon would you think you'll feel comfortable returning? Immediately? Within the first month? Within the second month? 3 months or more? I'm not coming back. And what you can see is we're gratified that very few people are saying they don't plan to return, but that the majority of the membership base will phase in over time. So 26% say they'll come back right away, another 26 within the first month. So there's about half of your membership base. But then the rest will filter in over time. And it's entirely related and influenced by the degree of concern they have about the COVID situation, which is reflected in the crosstab chart on the right side. So going down the far left-hand column there is the question that we're asking, when are you going to come back? And then across the top, we have another question: how concerned are you about the COVID outbreak? From not concerned at all to very concerned. And if you read down each of those concern columns, and in particular, just to simplify it, focus on the row that says they're immediately coming back. What you can see is if somebody's not concerned or has very little concern, they're going to come back immediately or soon thereafter. To the degree that their concern increases, then they're less likely to come back immediately and will come back later once they feel more comfortable. Next slide. We asked, so it was clear from the opening strategies that other people are employing that we're going to have a change in a number of different procedures, and so we're still considering some of these, but we tested a number of procedures to see what our pass holders' tolerance level would be by asking, if we had this new procedure in place, would you still visit the rec center? So we asked about 4 different procedures. Reserved time for use is required. You just can't walk in anymore. Face masks are required except in the wet areas of the facility. A 90-minute time limit for use is in effect, and then we boot you out. Temperature checks are required for rec center entry. And we didn't say we're doing any of these necessarily, but these are all hypotheticals, and we're testing, sort of what tolerance is. And what you can see is tolerance is pretty high, and is lowest for face masks at 77%, but everything else in the mid to high 80s. And these two on the right here, 90-minute time limits and the temperature checks being the one that we were most skeptical about in terms of customer tolerance. If you look at that chunk of the consumer base that says they're coming back immediately or at least within the first month, those two are even higher. Tolerance for those is in the low 90s. Next slide. And then we also asked in an open-ended question, so pass holders could write in their responses, what would need to happen for you to feel comfortable using your rec center after it reopens? And the responses that we got, about 2,500 people wrote in and responded to this question. We categorized their responses, as you can see represented here on the right-hand side. And the top 2 areas here really are reflected in terms of 2 things. One is the top COVID-19 improvements means I need to see a bending in the curve. So that's not really something that's controllable by us, but it represents sort of that I'm not going to do anything with any brand until I feel comfortable. I'm not going into a restaurant until I feel like it's safe. Well, it's the same thing with a rec center. So about a third said those kinds of improvements I need to see before I'm coming back and before I feel comfortable. But then the next one speaks to the earlier slide where we were talking about customer safety now being job 1. Cleaning and sanitation and comments about that were the most frequently mentioned thing that we can control. So, and then you have, the social distancing and capacity and all the things we talked about in the survey. They were just parroting back to us. But those top 3 things, bend the curve first, and then I'll come back, and then tell me how you're keeping me safe, was number 2. Next slide. All right, so Cindy and I wanted to add a couple of things here that indicate the progress that's been made to date on the rec center reopening strategy. You can see on the right-hand side depicted here, if you were to walk into any rec center now, the equipment layout would be completely different than what you were used to. Machines have been spread out so that we can accommodate the necessary social distancing. We've begun to communicate in the last couple of weeks more with our members. Both in terms of asking for customer feedback, but also in telling them that that we miss them, that we're concerned about them, that we're planning for their safe return. We're in the midst of developing and planning additional virtual programming, and that has been reflected in the virtual website that's up on our website. Brian's staff has been researching and developing cleanliness protocols and heightened cleanliness practices. We've been buying cleaning supplies and PPE. We've been looking into the incorporation in rec dynamics of a time ticketing system so that we could accommodate a reserved process for even facility users. Brian's staff has done a series of customer journey walks to get a better indication of the pinch points in facilities and to be able to respond to those. And we're in the midst of doing plexiglass installation at the front desks now. So that's kind of where we are with the progress to reopening. That's it. Happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Nick. Great job. Questions out there? Yes, Mr. Quincy.
Good presentation, Nick. How do our strategies and actions compare with the park authorities or agencies of Northern Virginia and close in Maryland?
Well, Brian has a group that is meeting almost every week on Wednesdays that consists of all of the operators from all of the major agencies in the Northern Virginia region and even some outside of this region in Virginia, down as far as Charlottesville. That really has been more of a conversation than sort of a webinar kind of thing where people are talking back and forth about different strategies and getting reaction from different groups in the area. So much like Kirk and the director's office are meeting at their level with agencies to coordinate responses, Brian is doing that at the operational level as well.
Thanks, Nick.
Yes, Ron Kendall.
Yeah, I had a question about Audrey Moore in particular and the senior center that's attached to Audrey Moore, as well as the Innova, I guess, physical therapy booth that is in that rec center. Would those be remaining within those facilities? Will we be adjusting that? Are they staying closed, staying open? Or are we expanding any of those opportunities into the other rec centers themselves?
I'm going to have to defer to Cindy Walsh.
Mr. Kincannon has got his hand up.
Okay.
This is Kirk Kincannon, Executive Director of the Park Authority. A good question. Based on our conversations with Neighborhood Community Services and the phased opening, of course, one of the greatest categories of concern is seniors. So right now, there are no plans that we're aware of to open the senior center at the same time that we open the rec center. Now, that could change, given, as Nick said, biological improvements out there related to a vaccine. But in our discussions, there is no rush to open senior centers at this time since they are a highly vulnerable population.
Other questions? Nick, thank you very, very much. Appreciate it. That was a lot of good work there.
Thank you.
All right, the next two items are going to be information items only. And so this is going to be a presentation by Mike Baird and Cindy Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Baird here. Hannah, if you don't mind, could you please bring up information item number 2? It's the 2020 third quarter for the general fund.
Do you want the, is that the 10,001 or the 8,000?
10,001, please. All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, perfect. And maybe we can scroll it up just a shimmy there. Perfect. Thank you. This is information item 2. This is the third quarter status for the general fund. As the board will notice, it's a somewhat skinnied up version of what we have done in the past. We normally would provide some narrative there of where we're coming from and how we anticipate the year going. But with all the impacts of COVID, obviously from the end of the third quarter to the end of the fiscal year, it really just totally changed the game. So what we wanted to provide to the board is really just the comparisons to where we are this year compared to where we are last year, and then the variances there to give the board, at least perspective as of the end of the third quarter. Are there any questions on that? Okay, Hannah, could you bring up information item number 3? And this would be the one for 80,000. Okay, thank you. This is information item 3. This is one for the Park Revenue Fund. This is the one, obviously, that the Park Authority Board does have fiduciary control on. We did not put the narrative there, but we did kind of hit on some of the highlights. As of the third quarter, you can kind of see where revenue was compared to last year. We're up $1.1 million. And even as we had mentioned in our presentation last month, that revenue figure really would have been up even higher if not for the impacts of COVID that started taking effect in March. So at that point, you kind of see where we are for revenues. Hannah, can you scroll down and then we'll go into the expenditures. Expenditures of $33.4 million compared to $35.8 million last year. So we were doing as a staff and as an agency a great job controlling costs. Costs were down about $2.4 million compared to where we were last year, or a decrease of 6.7%. And there you can kind of see those costs, those savings spread out among the cost centers. Any questions on information item 3? And then behind this, we also have some of the normal attachments that we would really provide to you. I'm not sure if you want to go through those or not at this time.
I think we've got them all, Nick. We can go through them. If we've got questions, we'll circle back.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, sir.
Okay. So are there any questions? So information item number 2 was the FY 2020 third quarter budget review, Fund 10,001 for the general fund. And countywide information item number 3 was the FY 2020 third quarter budget review, Fund 80,000, which is the revenue and operating fund. Any questions or comments from any of the board members? I think through March, you guys, the staff did an absolutely tremendous job, and that's shown there. So kudos to the entire team for all the great work that you did, putting us in that position. It'll lessen the impact a little bit, but we'll see where we go. Ron Kendall, you have a question?
No, actually, no question, but I want to make it sure that everybody understands that the work we did last year set the table for us being able to do what we did this year so far. The streamlining and controls we put on our expenditures last year put us in a really good place for this year. even though we didn't expect it.
That's a great point. Thanks, Ron. Anyone else? Okay, thank you. So this is Bill Bowie. We will now go into closed session.
This is Mike Thompson. I move the Park Authority Board recess and convene in closed session for the discussion and consideration of matters enumerated in Virginia Code 2.2-3711 and listed in the agenda for the meeting as follows. Discussion or consideration of the acquisition of real property for a public purpose or for the disposition of publicly held real property where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body pursuant to Virginia Code 2.2-3711A3.
Ken Quincy, I second the motion.
Bill Bowie, all of those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Motion carries. We are now in closed session for approximately 25 minutes.
We are now back in open session, everyone.
Okay. Mr. Thompson?
Mike Thompson. This is Mike Thompson. I move the Park Authority Board certify to the best of each member's knowledge only public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements under 2.2-3712 and only such public matters as were identified in the motion by which the closed meeting were convened were heard, discussed, or considered in the meeting by the board.
Ken Quincy, I second the motion.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed say nay. The motion carries. Mr. Hackman, C3.
Tim Hackman. I move the Park Authority Board authorize the offer range for property located in the Dranesville District as discussed in the closed session.
Mr. Chairman, this is Mike Thompson. I second the motion.
Okay, is there any other discussion? All right, all of those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Was there a nay?
No, nay.
All right, we'll conduct a roll call. Dr. Adu?
Aye.
Dr. Carter?
Aye.
Maggie Godbold?
Aye.
Linwood Gorham?
Aye.
Tim Hackman?
Aye.
Ron Kendall?
Aye.
Faisal Khan?
Aye.
Quincy?
Aye.
Kyle Stone?
Nay.
Michael Thompson?
Aye.
Jim Zook? Jim?
He's muted.
Jim?
Aye.
Okay. Okay, the ayes have it. The motion carries.
Okay. I'm Maggie Godbold, and for C4 action, I move the Park Authority Board authorize the offer range for property located in the Sully District as discussed in closed session.
Tim Hackman. I second.
Is there any discussion? All of those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. The motion carries. Thank you, everyone. Especially a big shout out to staff and to all the board members. Keeping your sanity, and for the park staff has done an absolutely tremendous job in spite of overwhelming odds in making it happen. Last week they opened up all of our parks in the course of 2 days. It was absolutely unbelievable, and we got an on. I just hope all of you folks out there stay well, stay safe, wash your hands, wear your mask, and with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. See you soon.
Good night. Be safe.
Bye-bye. You too.